Let's review the reports that are most commonly required by your accounting professional or needed by yourself to properly file your year-end taxes and to prepare for business planning. Before getting into the reports themselves, let's go over some tips to really keep yourself organized and prepared for year-end reporting and business planning. Many of these reports we're going to look at today should be run on a monthly basis at a minimum. When I do so, I like to maintain a copy of them for each month of the year so I can review retroactively if any particular account may change in the future. To facilitate this process, I have created folders on my computer to save these reports in. Having the reports saved at the moment you ran them is particularly convenient because by default, Design Manager has a timestamp on each report. Let's take a look at this. Here is the aged accounts payable report, which I ran earlier today. You can see at the top section here that it shows the date and the time the report was ran. Why is this handy? Well, let's say we printed this report back in August and we print the report again today and we notice the values have changed on the report. I can see that something was added, deleted, or edited between August and now. This makes it much easier to track down what has changed. We'll review this report later in more detail. Another convenient tip for year-end reporting is to have all of the necessary reports already saved in the favorites area of your reports window. In Design Manager, if I go to AR Reports, I'll see my favorites section over here. So you'll see that you have a Favorites tab, which you can save your most commonly used reports for easy access. To add a report to your favorites, you would just highlight that report and at the bottom, click Add to Favorites. You can get even more sophisticated by adding folders like you see here in mine for all of my year-end reports. Now for today, we're going to be looking at the income statement, balance sheet, and trial balance, along with open client deposit, open vendor deposit, work in process, aged accounts receivable, and aged accounts payable, plus sales tax. You can find all of these reports under any of the report tabs at the top. So for example, under accounting, I can find all of these reports under the AR report section or the AP report section. As well, if I go to the project tab, I can also find these reports under project reports. Let's start with our income statement. Now, the income statement, also known as the P&L or profit and loss report, measures the company's financial performance for the year by summarizing the sales or revenue, cost of goods sold, and expenses for both client-related and non-client-related activities. The income statement is found under the General Ledger folder, and then under your Financial Statements folder, and then in the Income Statements folder. In brief, this report shows account balances for the selected month and year-to-date totals. Let's go ahead and print our monthly income statement. Here we can see our sales, cost of goods sold, operating expenses, other income expenses, and our total net income. This report shows three different types of accounts, the first being your sales or revenue. This is from invoicing the client and assigning sales categories to items. Next is our cost of goods sold account. This is from recording vendor invoices upon project POs, which usually realized after the merchandise has been invoiced to the client, moving the cost out of work in process and into the appropriate cost of goods sold account. Next, we have our expense account. Generally non-project related expenditures necessary to run the business itself, like insurance, rent, marketing, and office supplies. Now, this report analyzes our net income for the year. We need to review the report that shows the flip side of this, which is going to be our balance sheet. Now, the balance sheet is going to be found under General Ledger and Financial Statements. Let's go ahead and print this report, and I'm going to unselect Show Prior Year. The balance sheet is used to display the overall financial health or worth of the company by analyzing the assets of the company against the liabilities and equity. So we can see a couple different accounts here. First is the assets account. This is areas of value within the company, such as cash, work in process, equipment, etc. Next is our liabilities account, sources that withdraw value from the company, like accounts payable, bills that we owe, sales tax, etc. And then finally, we have equity. This is the accumulated capital employed of the company, representing essentially the net worth. Think of it as the area where the owners or owner of the company has withdrawn assets like stock and owner's draw or income. On this report, we can see our net income. Now, the third report that your accounting professional will ask for is the trial balance. This can also be found under General Ledger down here at the bottom. Let's go ahead and print this report. The trial balance lists all accounts and their current balance, essentially consolidating the information from the income statement and balance sheet onto a single report. We can see our asset accounts in the 10,000 range, such as our work in process, 17,100. Next is our liabilities account in the 20,000 range, such as our American Express credit card here at 2,100. Next, we have our equities in the 30,000 range, our sales and revenue in the 40,000 range, cost of goods sold in the 50,000 range, expenses in the 60,000 range. Now, all of this will match our balance sheet and income statement in account type order. Your asset, cost of goods sold, expense accounts usually maintain a debit balance. We can see that here in the first column, while our revenue, liabilities, and equity maintain credit balances, which we can see here in the last column. At the end of the report, the net debits and credits totaled should always match, as every accounting transaction must debit one or more accounts for the same amount it credits one or more different accounts. In accrual counting, which is the method Design Manager utilizes and is the recommended method for interior designers and firms, the balance sheet, let's pull that back up, also displays information for a few specialized accounts, including accounts receivable, vendor deposits, and work in process on the asset side, accounts payable and client deposits on the liability side. These specialized accounts all have reports, which are often referred to as subsidiary journals, that provide particular insight into what transactions derive the current balance shown on the balance sheet. We'll briefly review each of these reports as they're often needed for year-end review as well. We're going to examine these reports in the order of the design process. I'm going to go back to my project reports here, and I'm going to go to my open client deposit report, which can be found under accounts receivable. And it's right here, the open client deposit. The Open Client Deposit Report displays deposits on proposals and retainers that you have recorded from your client, but not yet applied to a client invoice. The report will also show client invoice transactions that utilize retainers and deposits. The report is used as a physical representation of the activity that is currently held in the client deposit liability account. This is a liability as the funds still belong to the client until they're utilized on a client invoice. Now let's take a look at this report, and we're going to run this report in our detailed format. Let's go ahead and take a look at these different transactions. At the top, I can see a recent proposal for Bloom. I have received a deposit on that proposal, and I'm not ready to invoice for this proposal yet, as the items are not ready to be installed or delivered. Now, next is our sides project. I can see a retainer here for $2,500, and I can see by the date that this is fairly recent, but I want to go in and check to see if there were any invoices I could apply this retainer to. And lastly, we have Gwen Stacy down here. This is also a very recent proposal, and I'm not ready to invoice for those items on that proposal yet. It's a good idea to check over this report for problem transactions because it may mean that you actually owe the client money back. Our next report is the Open Vendor Deposit Report, which can be found under Accounts Payable and down here in the middle, Open Vendor Deposit. Vendor deposits are initial funds for the vendor so that they can begin processing the order. The Open Vendor Deposit Report shows vendor deposits that have not yet been applied to a vendor invoice for the purchase order. The report will also show vendor invoices that use a portion of the original vendor deposit, leaving a balance of the deposit still available. This account is an asset as the goods and services still technically belong to the vendor, and you, in turn, can still ask for that money back. The activity remains here until the vendor deposit is applied to a vendor invoice representing the transfer of ownership from the vendor to your company. At that point, the activity moves from vendor deposits into WIP, or cost of goods sold. Let's go ahead and print this report and take a look at our transactions. Now we've got 3 vendors here with deposits not yet used on vendor invoices. Our first one here is a deposit for our vendor Bernhardt. This is pretty recent, which means the items haven't shipped yet. We don't need to pay or enter that vendor invoice. The fabric cut deposit down here at the bottom is from July, which is a good bit of time, but I know this order and it's been delayed. And so we don't have to pay the balance or enter that vendor invoice yet. Now, if we see problem transactions, why is this bad? Well, if there are transactions on this report that are outstanding, we're overstating the net income of the company. When we receive the final bill from the vendor, we need to enter that so these transactions move from assets to cost of goods sold. If these deposits were refunded by the vendor, maybe due to an order cancellation or no stock, then we need to enter the vendor refund or credit. Now, the Caracal deposit on here is a problem transaction. This is from back in February, which is a while ago. We need to check to see if this was refunded or check on the order. What happened to the order? Ultimately, this needs to be included on a vendor invoice to push into cost of goods sold, or this needs to be entered as a vendor refund. In our example here, this order was canceled, so we need to see if Caracal sent us a refund, and if so, we need to enter that. Next, we have our work in process report. That can also be found under Accounts Payable down here. When we receive and record an invoice or bill from the vendor, by default, Design Manager will record the cost of the goods and services first into the Work in Process Asset account. It will remain there until the client is invoiced for the good or service. At that point, the cost will be relieved from Work in Process and move into cost of goods sold. The client invoice, in effect, represents the transfer of ownership from your company to the client. Work in process is an asset account as your firm technically owns the good or service until the client is invoiced. Work in process can conceptually be considered as the company's inventory that has already been allocated to particular projects. Let's go ahead and print this report and take a look at the transactions. Now we can see 2 transactions here. The first is Bloom. These are fairly recent vendor invoices. Now I know these because we aren't actually ready to invoice the client for these. We haven't received these tables and we haven't installed them. Next, we have our Lane Living Room project. Now this is a vendor invoice from February, which needs looking at. This would be a problem transaction. Obviously, you need to invoice your client for merchandise or services. And further, you don't want to miss any incidental charges, such as the freight and restocking fees. These charges can have a big effect on your net income if not reimbursed by the client. Lastly, if the cost from a vendor invoice was prevented from properly moving from work in process in some manner, you will be overstating your net income. Now for this project, because of a mix-up with the client on specifying lamps, we offered to provide this lamp for free. So to move this off of my work in process, I would just create a client invoice with this item and override the price to 0. Our next report that we're going to take a look at is our aged accounts payable report, which you can find at the top under accounts payable. When we enter vendor deposits, vendor invoices, or operating expenses necessary to run the business itself, they will first move into the accounts payable liability account, provided the entries were not charged to a credit card as they await final payment via check, debit card, online payment, etc. Accounts payable is a liability account as the company is required to remit payment at some point to alleviate the debt. The aged accounts payable report tends to not have as many unnoticed, outdated transactions lingering as some of the other reports we're discussing, as your vendors will usually politely let you know if you owe them money. Ideally, the aged accounts payable report will match the transactions remaining on the payments window in your accounting tab. Let's go ahead and print our aged accounts payable and take a look at our transactions. We've just got one transaction here for Caracol. The Caracol invoice is one we need to look at. We saw this earlier on another report. We know it's a problem transaction that we need to review, and once we figure out what's going on with this and adjust it, it will drop from this report. You'll want to check over this report for problem transactions like duplicate transactions, which can understate your net income. Bills that remain unpaid for long periods of time can both affect your company credit and is also a marker against the strength of the company when getting appraised or evaluated for sale. Now, I mentioned the transactions that we see here on this report should match your payments in Design Manager. Your payments can be found under the Accounting tab in the Accounts Payable section. I'm going to click on the Payments and Checks button. And I can see we have a matching transaction here for our Caracol vendor. Now, our next report we're going to take a look at is our Aged Accounts Receivable report. This can be found in the Accounts Receivable folder right here at the top, Aged Accounts Receivable. After we have begun invoicing our clients for the finalized goods and services, the balance of the client invoices will remain in the Accounts Receivable Asset account until the client remits final payment. The account is an asset as the company is under the firm expectation that payment from the client will indeed be received at some point, thereby increasing cash flow. Let's go ahead and print this report and take a look at our transactions. We've got 3 projects here waiting on final payment from the client. Check over the most recent ones first, as this makes sense that the client hasn't paid these yet, like our balloon. Now this is from September, so I'll be resending these to the client to ask for payment ASAP. We do have some dated invoices, both for Jones and Gwen Stacy. Jones looks to be an invoice for removal of existing furniture, and so we need to either invoice our client for this charge or adjust the item to 0 if we aren't charging our client for this service. Gwen Stacy has 2 invoices, with one showing a balance due of a penny. This was due to an underpayment from the client. I can move this penny to retainer via cash receipt so the invoice will show as paid, and can apply that penny to a future proposal or invoice. There's another invoice which is a credit on the client's account. And this is okay because I plan to apply this credit to a future invoice. I can keep it here and will move off this report when applied to that future invoice. Or just like the other invoice with the penny due, I can move this credit over to the retainer. You'll want to check over this report for problem transactions because allowing clients to maintain long balance periods can severely hinder your cash flow. Any invoice that should not be on the report as it's a duplicate or an unpaid balance should be removed to maintain the proper value of your company. Now, there are a few other reports that your accounting professional may require, so let's take a look at these very briefly. A report commonly requested by your accountant would be the sales tax report. This can be found under Accounts Receivable near the bottom, Sales Tax. Let's go ahead and print this report, and I'm going to change the date to the beginning of the year so I can see a full statement. This report will show all invoices that I collected sales tax on, organized by that sales tax authority that I've entered into Design Manager. Our last report that you might want to send to your accounting professional is the account inquiry. Our account inquiry report can be found under General Ledger, Account Inquiry. I'm going to go ahead and print this report just so you could take a look. I'm going to leave my account range blank, but I'm going to change my starting fiscal month back to the beginning of the year. This report will show all transactions under each account. And you can see that account over here on the far left side. This will give your accounting professional good insight in case they found a problem transaction. Now, I hope some of you are inspired to get into your Design Manager and start reviewing these reports to begin getting prepared for upcoming tax and business planning time. When you review these reports, if you find problem transactions and need help understanding these or the reports, you can go to our Help Center over here in our Vision panel. At the bottom, you can search through any videos to help you, or you can search our knowledge base. You can also reach out for support by emailing support@designmanager.com, or you can set up a consulting meeting, which is $120 an hour, via the link shown here.